Welcome back to Control the Freak. Today we're going to look at permission. Let's get into it. Welcome back. As I say, we're going to look again at permission. This kind of follows on from the last episode about Dave and Sarah, where I gave you the scenario that something had gone wrong around the events of a night out. Sarah had gone out for the night and there was a text exchange in the early hours of the morning that led to the derailing of the relationship. And the idea of that episode was to give you the DDE equation again to help you understand where control was really happening in that relationship. The fact of the matter is, if you took that night on its own, it was a nothing burger. Neither one of them had done anything wrong at all. There wasn't really any demand, disproportionate benefit or escalation in any of that night's events. The escalation happened afterwards for one of them. And what it did was it led to them becoming the control freak. And that was through fear and suspicion. That was the whole point of that episode. It wasn't to point the finger at either one of them. As I say, the actual events of the nights amounted to nothing. I hope that was clear. But that kind of leads me on to reintroducing the idea of permission again. So for those of you who haven't watched the early videos, I probably need to explain the concept of permission again as far as controlling people are concerned. And I don't blame you if you haven't gone back and watched those early videos. The video itself, the lighting, and particularly the audio is awful. We were just learning how to do this, and hopefully it's got a little bit better, a little bit easier on the eye at least, even if my voice still sounds like I'm chewing gravel. But to try and make sense of it for you, the first episode was about control freak evolution, how somebody becomes a control freak. And I identified two kinds that weren't born as a control freak. You've got your long-term influence event control freak and your high impact event control freak. Remember, it goes event, drive and permission. So you have these two event control freaks, and what that does to them is it creates a drive to regain the control that they've lost. And eventually they manage to evolve into control freaks by way of permission that other people give them to act that way. And that might sound confusing if you haven't watched those early videos. When I say that you give them permission as if it's your fault, that's not what it means. It's how control freaks interpret your reactions to them as permission. I gave you the concept of the glass hula hoop, and I said that for most people, the limits to their boundaries, what they're going to put up with, what they'll allow, are off in the distance. They don't think about it because they're reasonable people. There's a little bit of give and take in their life. But for control freaks, their boundaries are so rigid, so paranoid, that they've shrunk them down to about a foot away from them, like a hula hoop that goes around them, and they hold on to it tightly. I call it the glass hula hoop because it's inflexible, it's also fragile, but it's also, nobody else can see it, like it's made of glass. The way that hula hoop works, those boundaries, is that if you're on the outside and you come too close, the control freak will react badly. If you're on the inside, or they think you should be on the inside, you're in even more trouble, because if you try and cross that hula hoop threshold to freedom, you're now betraying them. This thing to them is a very, very strong barrier. In fact, they wouldn't even think it was made of glass. If you were to ask them what that barrier was made of, they might say steel. And that's why they're so confident using it to barrel their way through life, barging into people and expecting them to get out of the way. They use this hula hoop like a battering ram, with the kind of confidence only somebody who's used, abused, manipulated and coerced people could ever possibly have in such an object. They don't seem to realise how fragile it is. And I never did. It's only in hindsight I realise how fragile it is. But it's when they barrel through people, they barge into you and you take a backward step. That's permission for the control freak. Every time you take a backward step when they advance and they demand compliance, interpret as permission to the control freak. It's odd, but that's the way it is. You've just agreed with them as far as they're concerned, and they'll do it again and again and again. They will always escalate because now that becomes the minimum compliance. This is now the minimum I expect from you, because the fact that you took a backward step tells me you've agreed to everything else. So this is now the new minimum, and I want more. I'm going to keep walking towards you and demanding that you take a backward step and accommodate me. And every time you do, you're giving me permission. That's one of the ways that permission works as far as the controlling mind is concerned. There's another way that it works. I gave you the story of my stepdad, how he came into my life when I was around 5 years old, totally took over the house. He was demanding, he was aggressive, he was violent, he was coercive, snatched control from everybody in the house. For some reason, that hit me really hard, and it became my life's mission from then on to regain the control that I'd lost. And every time somebody took a backward step, I interpreted that as permission and carried on. So eventually my territory shrunk to the size of this hula hoop so that it was in my eye line and I could see what I owned. And I just got worse and worse until it all went wrong in the end. But the point is, I saw his behaviour as my permission. All through my early years and into my teens, as far as I was concerned, I could point to that guy and say, he did this to me, and that's why I behave this way. That was my form of permission. It gave me permission to act that way because I had this horrible thing done to me. And all control freaks will have this event. And it was helped, depending on how you look at it, with the advent of shows like Ricky Lake, Oprah, etc., who would have psychologists on, who first started introducing the idea that you are the way you are, it's not your fault, it's because something's been done to you. And I remember seeing these shows, putting two and two together, pointing at my stepdad and going, well, I already thought it was his fault, but now you've just told me it's definitely not my fault. As far as I'm concerned, I now have permission to carry on. And that's the two types of permission that control freaks think they have. The one that they take from you and the one that they think they've already got because something's been done to them. And that's why they'll act like this in relationships as well. They'll be able to point to things that you've done and say, yeah, well, I'm only acting like this because you did that. So they now have permission to act like this because of something you've done. That's how their minds work. So hopefully that explains permission again for people who haven't seen the early episodes. So what do you do about that? Well, there's two very important things as far as permission is concerned, and that's timing and motivation. And all the way throughout this, you need to question yours. You don't want to become the monster. But let's look at timing first. So I already gave you the flag phrases early on, and that wasn't exhaustive. As I said, there's more to come. I think there's another one to come, possibly the next episode or the one after that. There's going to be more flag behaviour and flag phrases. In the Kristen Mitchell episode, I gave you a link to one of his videos that he created where he'd used AI to create a control freak who was answering a victim. So the victim has these things that they say to the control freak, and then the control freak reacts, how control freaks always do. And I said at the time on that video, it was brilliant. It was like listening to me. Bill Mitchell, the father of murdered Kristen Mitchell, really does understand control. Unfortunately, he's had to learn the hard way. But that's why the flag phrases and Bill Mitchell's examples, I think there's possibly 12 examples on the Bill Mitchell episode/audio. These are your early opportunities to withhold permission or withdraw permission. So my flag phrases are things like people demanding chaos, demanding jealousy, demanding constant contact. They want to help too much. They want to take your autonomy away. They want to keep you away from other people who might interfere with their progress in the relationship. They'll blame other people for the way they're behaving. It's the men I don't trust, remember that one. There's all these little flag behaviours that are early ways in which they're trying to get permission for the way they're behaving. And you have to withhold that as early as possible. So I'll point you back to the flag phrase episode, and I think next episode is going to have some more in. Watch them and start logging these behaviours and withhold permission for that behaviour as early as possible. But it's not always intimate relationship control freaks that causes the problem, is it? There's certainly people, plenty of people in my life in different scenarios, be able to point to my controlling behaviour, and they weren't in relationships with me. One of these is work. We have to work with controlling people, don't we? There's two really powerful ways to withhold permission from a control freak within work. I'm speaking from experience. These things definitely worked on me, although I would have never admitted it at the time. So now I can be honest about my behaviour. I can also be honest about what beat me on lots of occasions. One of the most powerful ones is to absolutely refuse to engage. Now, imagine that control freak barreling through that room, expecting people to get out of the way. Imagine somebody who just turns their back on the control freak, who takes no notice of them whatsoever, doesn't argue with them, doesn't confront them, doesn't walk back scared, just doesn't care about them. Absolute refusal to engage. There's a couple of people who've done that throughout my life, and I'll admit now, we're actually really successful as far as dealing with me. Because I learned once they'd done it a couple of times, I was going to get nowhere with this person. Now, yeah, one or two of them, I would try and escalate with that person. I was very offended by the fact they wouldn't engage with me. And I'd try and escalate with them. I'd try and start fights or arguments with them to try and get myself into a situation where I could win. It was all about winning. But every time, these people would just refuse to engage with me. They wouldn't look at me. They wouldn't talk to me. They didn't look scared. They didn't look worried. They just refused to have anything to do with me. And you have to remember that control freaks, underneath all of it, no matter how bombastic they might act, they're very fragile. They've got no self-esteem whatsoever. And the idea that somebody dislikes you that much that they simply won't engage with you is absolutely devastating for a control freak. But again, it's timing. You've got to do this early on. Use the DDE and the 1 to 5 tool to identify you're dealing with a control freak. And one of your best ways of withholding permission is simply don't engage with that person. Another really powerful tool is logic, objectivity and logic. There was a manager I worked with in my early 20s, and I was a big guy and I had lots of testosterone. I was very, very angry. And I used to make demands most days. In fact, every day I would imagine. I would stomp my feet and I would demand compliance, that I got things my own way. And one of my favourite lines was, "I'm going to quit." And I got this new manager and I behaved like that in front of him. And he just stood there stony-faced, nothing. And he was only a little guy as well. He was only half my size. Stood there stony-faced with no reaction, waited till I finished and said, "Maybe you should quit." And I just remember being dumbfounded. He said, "Well, look around you. Nobody else is angry. Nobody else is upset, but you seem really angry. So yeah, maybe you should quit." And there was nothing in his tone of voice, nothing in his face that told me he wanted to argue, that he wanted a confrontation. It was just logic. And I couldn't argue with that logic because when I looked around, nobody else was upset. In fact, if they were upset, they were probably just upset with me acting like an arse. I probably tried it once or twice more with that guy, but I dropped it pretty quickly because he just said to me again, "Yeah, maybe you should leave." And I could see at some point this was going to lead to him saying, "Well, now I'm not suggesting you should leave. It's logical that you should leave. So leave." And I didn't want to risk that. It was never about quitting. It was always about getting what I wanted. Remember, if we go back to the Kristen Mitchell episode where her boyfriend made a big dramatic show of leaving the apartment. And I said it was never about leaving. He wasn't leaving. It was about a dramatic show to try and shock you into compliance. That's what he was trying to do. And he proved that by going back later on and doing what he did. And that's what we do all the time. We stamp our feet, we make a massive show demanding compliance. And when you give us compliance, we interpret that as permission. But the show doesn't mean anything. It's just a show. And that's why ignoring us or cold, hard logic is a really good way to refuse permission for us. But that brings me on to motivation and why you should always be questioning yours. The idea here is that control freaks should find their own enlightenment through people's refusal to give them permission. That's one of the ways in which I found enlightenment. I looked around and I saw that so many people were refusing permission, I had to take a good hard look at myself. It's not going to work for everyone, but it's not about you helping them. You don't want to be concentrating too much on what the control freak's doing and how they're reacting. They should find enlightenment through that refusal, but if they don't, it's not your problem. What you don't want to do is be so focused on refusing permission, that becoming your mission, that it changes you. Control freaks shouldn't change you, and if they do, you're doing it wrong. Control freaks should be secondary to you. It's their problem. It's not for you to deal with, and that's why you're refusing permission, hopefully. You're saying, "I'm not playing your game. That's your game to play. You either play this game politely with me or take it elsewhere." And they will do eventually. But what this shouldn't be is about forcing change, because that's not going to work. They'll just go to a path of least resistance, They'll take a look around and see who will take a backward step, and they'll just get there. You don't want to become like the I don't take any shit guy. Remember, he had his event, and as a result, he spent his life on the lookout for people who were going to try and snatch control away from him. And he was determined not to give permission for anybody to do that. It was all about his barrier, his glass hula hoop, and his obsession was about protecting that. Don't become that guy. All the way through this, your motivation should just be about protecting yourself. And if the impact of the control freak has you on the lookout like a meerkat, watching for what they're going to do, you're doing it wrong. And the danger is that when you do that, you're going to end up overguarding your situation. Much in the same way that one of the people in the Dave and Sarah story ended up doing. They became so worried and paranoid about their boundaries that they escalated and ended up causing a problem. Don't become the monster. Just don't let the monster overtake you. So hopefully that makes some sense to you. Withhold permission as early on as possible. Use the DDE equation and the 1 to 5 scale to identify when you're dealing with a control freak. And the minute you are, withhold and deny permission. And you've got a couple of tools for doing that. There's a flat out no. There's the flat out refusal to engage. There's logic. You can also demand good manners. There's plenty of people that I tried to dominate, and 1 or 2 of them would just say please. And they would demand I used good manners, because in that tiny little way, they were refusing me permission. I wasn't going to get things the way that I was used to getting them. I was going to have to do things their way. So I'd have to say please, and I would have to say thank you. It's another good tool for refusing permission. And then ultimately, always look at your motivation. Don't become the control freak, because control is pretty addictive and it can happen to anyone. And it's a very powerful drug, being able to take control of your surroundings and people around you. Don't get into arguments with control freaks either. Don't think to yourself, right, I need to beat that person and get into arguments with them. We roll out of bed ready for arguments. It's our bread and butter. If you get into an argument, as tempting as it might be to think, I'm going to beat that guy into submission, you're playing our game. And we'll always twist the outcome anyway. Other people will never hear the real story if the control freak's telling it. So you can never win, really. Just don't engage or demand politeness or use cold, hard logic. They're your best weapons against control freaks. Hopefully that's made some sense to you. I'm going to say to the new subscribers, there's the usual stuff that comes up down here. You can reach out to any of that to either share your story, if you want me to share it with others to help them, or if you just want some advice from somebody who understands what the control freak's thinking. Apart from that, leave you with the usual. Control the freak, not other people. See you next time. Behave. Like, share and subscribe.